Welcome back to Two Keto Dudes. This is Carl Franklin from Connecticut in the United States, currently in Old London, not in New London. And in February 2016, I put myself on a ketogenic diet to take control of my metabolism. In just 2.5 months, I managed to reverse all my markers of type 2 diabetes with diet alone. As of now, I'm about 80 pounds lighter with no signs of diabetes or heart disease.
Hi, I'm Richard Morris in Canberra, Australia, and actually today I'm in Sydney, Australia, not too far away. I've been on a ketogenic diet since April of 2014, and when I started, I was very sick with complications from type 2 diabetes. And within 6 months of starting a ketogenic diet, all of my biomarkers of disease had disappeared. I've lost about 100 pounds, and I've completely turned my health around.
And this show is a document of our experiences thriving for years in nutritional ketosis.
That's right, and reversing diabetes.
Yeah, and hopefully that might help a few people who are curious about this kind of dietary hacking.
We're not doctors. We don't want to give any medical advice, but we are keen to share our own experiences. We're actually both software developers, so we're not afraid of a little technical detail, are we, Carl?
No way.
Well, he isn't afraid of it. We have done some research into our own deranged metabolisms and the science behind them, and we share studies that we found in the show notes.
And you'll probably work out pretty quickly that we're both foodies. Mm-hmm. We love to cook and we love to eat.
Yep.
In every episode, we both share a keto recipe that cannot be ignored.
Mm-hmm.
Except for today, because I don't have one. More on that later. So let's start podcast number 142. Professor Jake Kushner, Paediatric Endocrinologist.
Heard you say you're due for a little.
So, Richard, do we have any apologies or corrections from last week's show?
Let's see. Last week was 141, the grandfather of ketogenic diets, Professor Stephen Phinney.
Yeah.
I wouldn't dare say that he got anything wrong. However, I had one person who we'll hear from in the mail ask, who is right, Professor Phinney or Dr. Fung? Professor Phinney is thoroughly researched and well-referenced, and I can't fault any of his arguments, but I suspect both may be right in context, and there's more of that later on in the mail.
Yeah, and the context is, just for people who don't know what that refers to, their thoughts about fasting and muscle mass loss, but we'll talk about that.
Only fasting.
So let's revisit what a ketogenic diet is. A ketogenic diet is any diet that puts you into a state of ketosis, where you're burning fat for energy rather than glucose. Mm-hmm. And a surefire way to do that is limit your carbohydrates daily to 20 grams or less.
Yeah, that's not a lot.
And get those carbs from leafy vegetables and above ground vegetables, green leafy vegetables. And protein you want to keep moderate. And we used 1 to 1.5 grams of protein every day for every kilogram of lean body mass that you have.
Yep.
And then you're going to eat fat to satiety. Oh, excuse me. You're going to eat fat to satiety.
And if you're just starting, listen to our Starting Keto show at start.2keto.com.
Right. Well, Richard, how was your week, man?
It was pretty stressful because I'm studying inorganic chemistry, which is a subject that I expect to not need after my exam on Monday. In fact, the exam should be tomorrow, which is Saturday, but I had to get a special exemption because on Saturday I'm emceeing the Low Carb Sydney event. So I obviously can't do that and do a chemistry final at the same time. So anyway, I got the exam changed. So I'm stressing because it's stuff that I'm interested in. I have no trouble studying. Stuff that I'm not interested in, I have a real trouble getting information in. It just doesn't seem to stick. So it's a little bit stressful for me. How was your week, Carl?
Pretty good. I've been working on my film and talking to my clients and doctors and trying to strategize about the way that this can have the most impact.
Nice.
And I'm in London right now visiting a friend. Mm-hmm. Old London. I went from New London to Old London, from the Thames River to the Thames River. That's right. And I'm visiting a friend who is trying to help me with that process. Mm-hmm. So I'm here for the entire weekend, and I'm very, very excited. But it was a sort of a last-minute trip, and as such, I wasn't able to prepare a recipe. So bad Carl. But I will find one, and I'll put it in the show notes for you when I get it done. So that's it. Well, let's give away some swag, buddy.
Yeah. Every show we pick a lucky winner at random from the members of the 2 Keto Dudes fan club.
Right. And today we're giving away a treasure trove of stuff from vendors we like, all of which you can find at fanclub.2keto.com.
We also need to mention a caveat. Most of our vendors can only ship inside the United States.
That's right. However, if we happen to pick someone outside the U.S., we will find something to send, but it probably won't be the whole treasure trove.
So who's our winner this week?
Today's winner is John Lucas III.
Congratulations, John. Let's tell everyone what John has won.
Yeah. All right. Well, the first thing John has won is a 2 Keto Dudes coffee mug with our mugs on it that says, "Keep calm and keto on. More sage advice was never given on this show."
And a signed copy of Lies My Doctor Told Me by Dr. Ken Berry online at lies.2keto.com.
And a bottle of Stevia Sweet Barbecue Sauce, developed by a barbecue restaurant owner who plans to change the restaurant industry forever. Only 2 carbs per serving, online at steviasweetbbq.com.
We also have a cheese-making kit from Wine and Whey. Pam Zorn gave everyone at Keto Fest a kit so they can make their own fresh mozzarella. It's available online at wineandwhey.com. That's wineandwhey.com.
And a 6-ounce cup of beef bone broth concentrate from Birthright Nutrition. Just add water, heat, stir, sip, and enjoy. Jam-packed with good stuff. More at birthrightnutrition.com.
We're also giving away a bottle of Remag Magnesium Solution developed by Dr. Carolyn Dean, along with a copy of her protocol, and the Keto and Magnesium Manifesto online at magmiracle.com.
We're also giving away a big bottle of fasting drops from Keto Chow. It's a well-formulated blend of electrolytes. Just drop a little in your water and fasting will be a breeze. Online at fastingdrops.2keto.com.
And 2 bottles of Sated, 1 chocolate, 1 vanilla, online at sated.2keto.com.
And from Keto & Co., a sampler 6-pack, a bag of brownies, 4 bags of different flavored cauliflower rices, and a bag of flatbread, online at ketoand.co.
And finally, a bag of everything bagels from Fox Hill Kitchens, made with yeast, but no wheat or gluten, online at bread.2keto.com.
And if you don't want to wait to win some swag, you can buy all sorts of it online at gear.2keto.com. And now it's time to read the mail.
You okay there, buddy? Yeah, it's getting weaker every week.
I know, it's terrible.
What you got, Carl?
All right, well, this one comes from the great big public keto before and after thread on our forum, which now has 507 posts in it.
Wow.
And you can get there at success.2keto.com if you want to see some success stories and hear about people's experiences. Mm-hmm. So this one is from Jenny. And she says, "I want to play too." In other words, I'm throwing in my success story. "Only the most recent 28 pounds has come off because I'm doing lazy keto, but I'd stalled for about a year in weight loss efforts and suddenly was gaining back again. Taking all sugar out and limiting fruit essentially put me into a keto diet. I had removed grain years ago and upped my healthy fats about 2.5 years ago. 94 pounds down, 17
Nice.
to go."
Mm-hmm.
Well done, Jenny. And her
Yeah.
picture is just amazing.
Yeah, well done.
You know, it's just amazing. Keep calm and keto on. As I said, sager advice was never given on our show. That seems to be just the secret sauce to just letting keto happen, letting your healing happen. Just let it work. So that's my mail, Richard. What do you got?
Yeah, I've got one from Facebook. I called out in the errata for the last week's show. This was actually a response to the post that we put with Professor Finney and myself talking about the ketogenic diet.
Right.
And this was from Rosemary, and she says, "I love listening to Professor Finney talk about keto, but I'm confused. I think I've heard him say that he doesn't agree with fasting, and his reasoning contradicts with what Dr. Fung promotes. What do we believe about fasting?" And I've got to say that we can have different opinions in this community, and we can still agree on the fundamentals. We shouldn't really have... In an ideal world, we wouldn't believe anything. We'd know it because we'd have confirmational evidence that is incontrovertible and everyone agrees with. But in fact, some of the evidence is interpreted and everyone will interpret the evidence in a different way. I would say both gentlemen agree on a lot of things. They both agree on low-carb, high-fat diets. They do have a differing opinion on the interpretation of the evidence with respect to adequate protein and meal timing, specifically fasting. And you'll have heard Professor Finney say that he has no problem with intermittent fasting. It's 18-6, even 23-1 if you really want. But he doesn't believe in fasts that go over 2 days, and he has good science to back that up. And you'll see this in his presentations. And two of the things that he really talks about, he talks about extreme protein loss after 2 or 3 days of fasting. Once you get over 2 days of fasting, he says that protein loss gets quite extreme. And so as a doctor, you're trying to keep lean tissue on people. You don't want people suffering from sarcopenia. And he also says that people's metabolic rates drop precipitously after the second day, and it takes a long time to after refeeding before they recover. And Dr. Fung says quite the opposite. He says in his clinical experience, he's fasted over 1,000 people, and he says the metabolic rates don't drop, and they don't have a loss of lean tissue. In fact, they have preservation of lean tissue. So I think both gentlemen are correct because they both have different contexts. Now, Dr. Finney referred to a number of studies, and there's not a lot of studies into fasting. There's ethical considerations about starving subjects is the first thing. Yeah. There was a time when we used to be able to do experiments that we probably can't ethically do now. And some of George Cahill's starvation in man experiments, which are really this is the gold standard for what we know about human starvation. A lot of these would, like, for example, the one where he dropped somebody who was starving dropped their glucose so low by giving them insulin that they should have been in a coma, and they were quite happily chugging along. We wouldn't be able to do that experiment now. It'd be unethical to do. So his George Cahill's starvation in man experiments, it's one of the experiments that's referred to by Professor Finney to describe the loss of lean tissue that occurs during fasting. We don't know a lot about the actual subjects that Dr. Cahill looked at, other than the primary subject was a middle-aged man. But we do know that he was able to draw down roughly 160 grams of body fat. So I can infer using the Alpert data that he was able to, firstly, he was able to deliver roughly 1440 kilocalories a day, and he had roughly 20 kilograms of body fat, and he was probably around 70 to 80 kilograms in weight. That subject is going to be different from the subjects, obviously, that Jason Fung looks at. They're obese, they're diabetic, and they have 100 kilograms of body fat. Right. Now, George Cahill's subject was able to make 1,440 kilocalories per day of energy from fat. So now most humans need roughly 2,800. So he's only able to make half the energy that he needs. And so he would have had to have reduced his metabolic rate, and he would also have had to find other sources of energy. He would have had to have cannibalized lean tissue to be able to supplement the arrears, So a person with, so that was a person with 20 kilograms of fat. They can produce 1,400 calories, and they need 2,800 a day, so they're going to be burning quite a lot of lean tissue to be able to support that, and the metabolic rate will drop. A person with, however, 40 kilograms of body fat can generate 2772 kilocalories a day, and that's almost enough to run a human being on a day without having to reduce their energy use or to burn lean tissue for energy. And this kind of explains why Dr. Finney says that the evidence has never been challenged that a fasting man reduces his metabolic rate and burns a significant amount of lean tissue. Dr. Finney in that context is correct. That evidence has not been challenged, and it probably won't be. But it also explains how Dr. Fung can say of his thousands of patients who come to his clinic who are obese and needing to reverse type 2 diabetes fast, that he has never observed significant metabolic slowdown or significant loss of lean tissue. So Dr. Fung can also be correct in that context. I'm going to put a link into the show notes to some of the math that I did on the subject of, and I put it on the ketogenic forum. It was a post I did quite some time ago. Right. But I want to call out something that Professor Finney did mention. He mentioned a very real risk that it is possible that people could kill themselves by fasting. This is one of the reasons why the Guinness Book of Records no longer has a longest fast category, because the guy who fasted the longest was 382 days, a Scotsman by the name of Angus Barbieri. Yeah, and a number of people have tried for that record and killed themselves, and so they removed that category. So Professor Finney's quite correct that people who are doing extreme unsupervised fasting could be doing permanent damage if, in fact, could kill themselves, and they could permanently damage the reputation of ketogenic diets. This has already happened in the 70s with the liquid protein diet, and it could happen again.
Right.
So, it's worth paying attention to that. There are some cowboys on YouTube who profess to be ketogenic coaches, but they're doing it without a strong understanding of the science. And there's one coach in particular who yells at fat people all the time on YouTube, advocating dry fasting, where he drinks his own urine.
Oh, that's crazy.
I think it's important to call out this kind of thing as the silly and dangerous fringe that it is, and to differentiate that from serious weight loss clinics who use supervised meal timing to help type 2 diabetics to reverse their disease. So that's just that's me on my soapbox.
Yeah. Well, Richard, I'm so glad that you put all this stuff into perspective, because there are nuances to this story, and people are always looking for always do this, never do that.
Right.
And it's just not that easy to do. You just can't think like that.
No.
And I'm really glad that you sort of unpacked it for us.
Yeah, I would say my general advice is I don't myself fast over 3 days. I have fasted for 10 days and I started to feel a bit weird, and so I pulled the pin. I don't fast over 3 days because the evidence hasn't shown any benefit after 3 days. Really, you hit maximum autophagy, maximum cleaning up of unnecessary proteins structures after 3 days.
And Megan says the same thing.
Yeah.
She recommends that her patients only do a 3-day fast.
Yeah. Well, Megan Ramos from the IDM. So this is exactly the case. I think one of the things that happened was Dr. Fun was involved in writing a book on fasting, and one of his co-authors spoke a lot about, long, 20-day fasts and what have you. And I think part of his message was conflated there. I mean, a 20-day fast supervised by a medical, physician is that could be entirely appropriate, but
We also know of people on the forum who fasted for 40 some odd days? Remember the guy that we did a show with him? He fasted for 40 some odd days.
Yeah, there are some religious undertones then. I think he was doing it for Lent, and he was, following some stories in the Bible. It's worth highlighting that this is quite risky behavior. It's like running a marathon every day for a month.
Right.
You could do it. Eddie Izzard, the English comedian and aspiring mayor of London, who has a similar face to me when we're both fat. Anyway, I digress. He was doing this marathon a day for like 40 days, and on like the 28th day or something like that, he came down with rhabdomyolysis, which is where you urinate out your muscles, which is a scary disease to get. Anyway, but ketogenic diets, as practiced by Dr. Finney, and intermittent fasting is practiced by the IDM clinic, are both well-known techniques for reversing diabetes. Both reverse diabetes, and there is clinical evidence in the literature to show that.
Great. Thanks again, Richard. That's awesome. Awesome insights there. That brings us squarely to our interview today that you did with Professor Jake Kushner. You want to introduce this for us?
Yeah, he's a great guy. So I met him at Low Carb Gold Coast. In fact, I had met him briefly in Breckenridge last year, but he was at Gold Coast this year, and he was one of the three guests, Dave Feldman, Stephen Finney, and Jake Kushner, who the three American guests, and there of course, obviously, were a lot of Australian presenters at this event. And we spoke at length about a wide-ranging subject, but essentially we were talking about ketogenic diets and type 2 diabetes, and then we spoke about my science career at one point. I'm not sure we recorded all of that, and he gave me a lot of really good advice over dinner about how to drive my science career. But anyway, this is the interview that we had at the Gold Coast just a couple of weeks ago.
Great. Let's roll it.
Mm-hmm. I'm here at Low Carb Down Under Gold Coast with Dr. Jake Kushner, Professor Jake Kushner.
Yes, Associate Professor Jake Kushner.
There you go. Okay. And he gave a wonderful presentation on his work with type 1 diabetics at Low Carb Down Under. Thank you very much. That was wonderful.
It was really my pleasure to be able to do this and to be able to meet all these incredible people at this event and really to sort of be able to talk about my passion, which, as you can tell, has been type 1 diabetes for essentially my entire professional career.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how you got here. How did you get to a low-carb conference professionally? What triggered you to look into low-carb treatments as a possibility for diabetics?
So I'm a pediatric endocrinologist, and I was very interested in trying to find some esoteric and interesting metabolic condition that I could in some way contribute to understanding and learning. And I thought I was going to be a basic scientist and find something rare and unusual. And I eventually discovered that pediatric diabetes was really very important to me. And I became a basic scientist. And also have an active practice caring for children and young adults with type 1 diabetes. And I began to get worried about basic science, wondering if I was ever going to see translation from my basic science career to help humanity, at least in my lifetime. And I started thinking about ways to try to be more creative about my clinical practice.
Right.
And I was feeling generally dissatisfied about how people live with type 1 diabetes, the sort of standard practices that are offered to them, and made the interesting observation that many people with type 1 diabetes had really gone off the rails in terms of the nutrition practice. One sort of pivotal event for me was back when I was a young doctor in Boston at Harvard Medical School. And I was with my friend, Dr. Mary Ann Quinn, who lives with type 1 diabetes herself, is a pediatric endocrinologist. And we were at this restaurant. We were actually at a pizza place, Bertucci's. And I saw her eating a Caesar salad, and she was picking the croutons off her salad.
Oh.
And I said to Mary Ann,
I can recognize that.
"What are you doing?" And she said, "Jake, I just can't eat this stuff." I said, "Why?" I said, "Can't you take insulin for it?" She goes, "Jake, it doesn't work like that." She goes, "The more carbs I eat, the stranger my blood sugars are. And I've just found that it's easier to stay away from carbs, and my blood sugars get closer and closer to normal."
Right.
So that was 20 years ago. And around this time, I met Dr. David Ludwig.
Okay. Yes.
And he was very interested at the time in low carb and the zone. And we would go to his obesity service and work as young doctors. And I remember saying to him, David, the greatest potential impact for low carb could be type 1 diabetes.
Right.
And he gave me this pained look. He said, "Jake, that's not nearly as big a problem as obesity."
Right.
But again, my focus has been type 1 diabetes. And so I wondered whether low carb could be uniquely helpful. Even 20 years ago. Fast forward 20 years, and what's happened to me is I moved from institution to institution. I was an instructor at Harvard Medical School, and then I was an assistant professor at UPenn in Philadelphia, and now more recently at the Baylor College of Medicine. And along the way, I've had many close friends and colleagues who themselves have type 1 diabetes. And this is sort of a peculiar aspect of the endocrinology world, but many people who are personally affected by type 1 diabetes decide to go into the field. So it's really wonderful.
It's the personal epiphany, isn't it?
Exactly, right. And so along the way, I've become very close with many of them and have discovered that they too are adopting low carb approaches. And over time, we've been trying to sort of think about and refine this stuff. So again, it really came from friendship. And companionship with people who have type 1 themselves and looking and trying to understand how it works and strategies. And so through all this thought, I began to realize that low carb was very powerful. Finally, a friend of mine Kelly Sarasolo, who's a nurse practitioner who has type 1 diabetes, said, well, do you know about Dr. Bernstein's book? And I said, what?
Yes.
Okay. So this is 7 years ago.
Yeah.
I got Bernstein's book and I was just blown away by it. And I started asking around, I'm like, do you know about this book? This is amazing. And people are like, oh, yeah, he's crazy. It shows you the strange stigma that low carb has had in the type 1 or in the endocrinology world, that many of my friends and colleagues simply thought that it couldn't be done or it shouldn't be done. And it took me a while of reading and learning and thinking to overcome my anxiety. Finally, to me, the real epiphany was when I read Gary Taub's Good Calories, Bad Calories.
Right.
And I read it over a period of 6 months, savoring every chapter.
Yes.
I would read a chapter, and then I would rush to my laptop and download a series of PDFs and read those articles.
Right.
And then when I felt like I'd understood it, I would go back and read some more.
Yeah. A chapter from Taub's is like an entire education.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right. So I read Good Calories, Bad Calories. My wife and I read quite a few chapters together. She finally said, okay, we just need to do this.
Personally,
as a family, actually.
Right. Yeah, okay.
And so we had been eating low-ish carb for a while, but we still had pizza and pasta and other things. Sure. And one day she literally eradicated enriched carbohydrates from our house. She cleaned them all out.
That's actually the trick, is to go through your pantry and find all the flour, all the sugar, all the honey, and just get rid of it, because you're not going to need it for at least the next 6 weeks,
right? And
hopefully the rest of your life.
And so we made the transition, and I can still remember how challenging it was. So, for instance, there was one point where I just said, I'm so hungry. And she looked at me, she goes, go eat some nuts. I can't be around you. And I went and ate about a cup of almonds.
Right, yeah.
So I was simply starving.
Yeah.
And essentially, I made the transition to fat burning. I still had a few more carbs in my diet than she did for a while. And then over the past year, we switched to nutritional ketosis.
Yeah.
And so my ketones my beta-hydroxybutyrate went from routinely 0.1 to 0.4 to now 0.5 to 1.5.
Nice.
And I've enjoyed it immensely. It's just been an amazing thing.
Yeah.
So I got interested in low carb. I started thinking about low carb. I'm working with Gary Taubes. I contacted Gary Taubes because I was just so amazed by his book.
Yeah.
He was very friendly. Through him, I met Peter Attia. And then Gary started introducing me to various people.
Right.
And then,
he's a great connector.
Oh, he's incredible.
Yeah.
And so then I found myself talking to Rod Taylor and Jeff Gerber.
Excellent.
And they invited me to give a presentation at Low Carb Breckenridge. And I heard about these low carb conferences, but I hadn't really presented in public on low carb except for one very small conference in San Antonio.
Yeah.
But Gary Taubes knew of my very strong interest and suggested that I might be a good speaker for Low Carb Breckenridge in 2017.
Yeah.
And so I accepted an invitation and made plans to go. And then I broke my leg in Japan and had to cancel.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I remember them telling us that story.
It's completely bonkers.
I think I don't remember who filled in for you, but I recall they were quite good as well. So yeah. But I'm glad that you managed to make it to 2018.
And again, by now I've gotten really used to thinking about low carb and had been giving talks, at least in my own institution, trying to really refine my thoughts about it.
Right.
I gave that talk at Low Carb Breckenridge. It was an amazing experience for me. And I continue to collaborate with a bunch of people in the low carb community. We actually even wrote a grant together. So when I say we, I mean myself and Gary Taubes and Dr. Daniel DeSalvo, the Baylor College of Medicine, and a few other people to try to get money to do a randomized controlled clinical trial for low carb and type 1 diabetes.
Right.
It was a very expensive trial. We wrote to a private organization. It wasn't funded. But again, my hope is that the essence of that trial will ultimately play out over time, and that there will be young people and funding agencies that will realize the opportunity to transform clinical outcomes with type 1 through research.
I think the Lenaz paper, the one that David Ludwig was a senior researcher for, I think that mandates a study like this, because it basically puts forward a series of well-documented anecdotes and are really a generation of hypothesis. A low-carb diet enables type 1 diabetics to maintain incredible glucose control.
Yeah, that paper is amazing, and it describes this community in Facebook called Type 1 Grit, which was created by R.D. Dykman, and it's a group of 3,000 people, primarily people who live with type 1 or loved ones of people who live with type 1, but also healthcare providers such as myself. Yeah. I'm a member, right. Who are interested in low carb and specifically the approach advocated by Dr. Richard Bernstein. And so it's a wonderful community. And in this closed Facebook group, you see narratives from people. So you might see a picture of food, a picture of a happy kid eating food. You might see continuous glucose monitor tracings. Yeah. You might see somebody holding up a hemoglobin A1C testing device showing that their hemoglobin A1C was 5.3%, and they have a big smiling face. And you'll also hear amazing narratives about how people feel like their lives have been changed by using low-carb approaches. And again, it's worth pointing out that type 1 diabetes is a very complex condition. So in type 1 diabetes, people have a complete inability to make insulin, and they have to replace that insulin with injections, and it just doesn't work well. So it's very difficult to effectively replace. The long-acting insulin is a little bit challenging because normally our pancreas has a lot of dynamic capacity to make more or less insulin. Yeah. And if you inject insulin or use an insulin pump, you're just sort of dumping in a predictable amount or a semi-predictable amount. With no ability to dynamically respond to blood glucose. Yeah. And then also there's a requirement for short-acting insulin response to meals or some sort of other acute stressors. Yeah. And that's very difficult to effectively replace. And I think even for non-diabetic humans, this high-carb lifestyle that we're living in can make people sick. But for people who can't make insulin, it's especially problematic because it's really challenging to replace the lost insulin from your pancreas with a giant whomping shot of insulin. Yeah.
How do you replicate the concentration gradient between the pancreas and the periphery? Right. Is it possible?
Yeah, and even stranger, we inject insulin in the periphery, but normally the pancreas produces insulin in response to glucose that comes through the portal vein, and it acts directly upon the liver. Right. So there's a whole pharmacokinetics that's broken. There's also the incretin system. So by the time we think about food, smell food, realize we're hungry, put ourselves in a position to eat, the whole insulin secretion system has been primed by the incretin pathway that secretes GLP-1 and GIP-1. Yeah. And these hormones activate your insulin secretion capacity even before the food hits the mouth. Yeah. And we can't replicate that by injecting a shot. And it's what we've traditionally said to people is, okay, so you have to predict the meal that you're going to eat and inject insulin 15 to 35 minutes before the meal in order to have blood sugars at the stable range after the meal. Yeah. It's ridiculously hard. It just doesn't work. Yeah. It's very difficult.
So mechanical pancreases, I know that this was something that people were saying this would be, the solution would be to implant a pancreas. They really run on glucose, don't they? There's a glucose calibration for an insulin dose. So it's going to miss that incretin.
Yeah, and there's a whole time delay as well. And the problem is when you inject insulin, you're injecting a hormone that lasts for several hours, but the insulin that is contained within our blood has a half-life of 5 to 7 minutes. Yeah. So our pancreas secretes insulin directly into the blood and has this massive dynamic capacity. Yeah. But when you inject insulin, you're just sort of committing yourself to several hours of insulin action. There's different kinds of insulin. Yeah. The shortest ones last for maybe 3 hours, and the longest ones last for several days. Right. But what we don't have is an insulin that only lasts for minutes or seconds that could then be controlled by a pump. Yeah. And so the problem is by the time the automated insulin delivery system senses that your blood glucose is high and it decides to give you more insulin, it's going to take 30 to 60 minutes to act. Right. And so imagine, if you will, driving down the road and you have a funny sort of steering wheel that only responds 30 minutes after you make a change.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Well, obviously what's going to happen is if you drove in a city, you'd just run off the road. You'd crash.
Yeah.
But if you drove out in the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah.
Long straight roads.
Or no road at all.
Yeah.
You would drive. But of course, what you'd see if you went from a helicopter up above is you'd see a sine wave. You'd see an S-curve.
Yes.
And the reason is you'd be adjusting back and forth.
Yeah.
And actually, this happened to me once when I was sailing. For the first time, I held the tiller. I had friends and we went sailing on a J boat in San Francisco Bay.
Lovely.
And they had me holding the tiller, and we're going from Berkeley out into Angels Island. And my friend Mike looked at me, goes, "Jake, look back." And we looked back, and there was a sine wave in the water
in the wake.
because I had been turning back and forth back and forth.
Yeah.
And what he said is, you can't respond because the problem is the boat takes too long to respond to the tiller. Just pick a point and stick with it and then change. That essentially is the essence of low carb.
That's a great analogy. Yeah. That describes the flattening of the trace. You don't have all of these big peaks. You're not on a roller coaster.
Right.
And so because there are smaller peaks, it's a law of small numbers, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a law of smaller numbers. And it also suggests that you probably want to reduce the number of times that you intervene.
Yeah.
And I do believe, just as an aside, somewhat non-scientific, I think this snacking culture that we live in is utterly toxic. I am not at all convinced that people need to eat 5 meals a day. No. They probably need to eat 5 meals if they're mostly sugar burning and they're hungry.
And they have a pancreas that can still produce the right amount of insulin.
But to go back to that sailing analogy, the idea is you're holding the tiller, you're looking at a point far away, and you're trying to line up some point on the sailboat with a point that's far away, and you're going to try to stick with it and then make few adjustments.
Right.
That's the equivalent of having only a couple of meals a day.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm a type 2 diabetic and our problem is slightly different, but there is some similarity in that we don't make the right amount of insulin.
Right.
And so for us, if we don't eat a lot of glucose, we make our livers basically take over the homeostasis.
Yeah.
So no longer is our pancreas being the homeostatic organ that's controlling glucose. Our liver becomes it makes glucose on demand, and then the amount of insulin.
And it makes glucose when it's not on demand. It makes way too much.
In my case, it does. It definitely does. So, that I have to take metformin for that. But it replaces the homeostatic regulation. So, this is the same kind of thing that's happening for type 1 diabetics. A type 1 diabetic takes their long-acting insulin, and because they're not eating a lot of glucose through the day, and they're not eating a high-protein diet, if they're on a ketogenic diet, then the amount of insulin that they need is pretty much stable most of the day, and then they make the glucose on demand.
And amazingly, so with type 1 diabetes, what you get is tremendous insight into human physiology because, so for instance, people who are on a high-carb diet and have type 1 diabetes, well, they require enormous amounts of short-acting insulin. So if they are, I've seen these kids who are consuming gobs and gobs of carbohydrates, huge amounts of insulin, they end up gaining weight, and then their long-acting requirements go up as well. On the other hand, if you're able to reduce carbohydrates to very small amounts, again, this is the Bernstein rule of small numbers, small amounts of carbohydrate or small amounts of insulin requiring meals mean very small doses of insulin and less opportunity to get off track, to have blood sugars that are high or low.
Yeah. You can hear a helicopter going by. We're actually sitting on the beach, believe it or not. And so that's a surf rescue helicopter going by. You can probably hear the sounds of the ocean in the background. It's a wonderful view that Dr. Kushner has from his place. So what are the barriers and challenges for a type 1 diabetic in taking up a ketogenic diet? Because it's going to be different for them than somebody like me who can make insulin.
Well, there's a bunch of interesting and unique components to this question. One is, where do you learn? And there is this wonderful book from Dr. Bernstein, which has sort of been the Bible of the low carb community for type 1. There's also a terrific book by Adam Brown. So Adam Brown has written a wonderful book called Bright Spots and Landmines, which is essentially like an owner's manual for someone who lives with diabetes, but it's especially focused on type 1. And it has a lot of great tips on nutrition and low carb, but also just wonderful all-around tips on living with diabetes and stigma and lifestyle and exercise and wellness.
I need to read it.
You need to meet him. Yeah. He's a really incredible, amazing guy. He works for Close Concerns. Kelly Close runs a consulting business that provides a sort of assessment around diabetes-related industries. And so he has type 1, and he's very thoughtful about the way he approaches living with type 1. And unfortunately, these two books, Dr. Richard Bernstein's Diabetes Solution and Adam Brown's Bright Spots and Landmines, are about the only books that I know of that really approach low-carb nutrition. And many people who live with diabetes, type 1 or type 2, have few other solutions other than the internet and what I would call secular, i.e., non-classical medical solutions. And the issue is there's just been tremendous cultural barriers for endocrinologists and diabetologists and diabetes centers and classical nutritionists to think about and get engaged and participate.
Right.
And I'm utterly perplexed by this because as a physician, I want to do everything I can to support the people who come to me seeking care.
Right.
And I can't imagine not trying to look for innovative new solutions. I mean, it's abhorrent to me. But there are these huge barriers, and people in the classical endocrine field have made up a bunch of very strange excuses as to why low carb couldn't or shouldn't work for a particular patient population.
Right.
So one of my real passions is to try to bridge the gap in between the people who live with type 1 or type 2 diabetes and classical endocrine, academic endocrine, diabetes centers, etc. And I feel like if we talk about in objective terms what's happening to people who live with diabetes who use low carb approaches, and this Facebook group Type 1 Grid is a wonderful example of that. We should be provoking some insightful questioning within the traditional academic endocrine fields. And my hope would be that over time there would be requests for applications, particular pots of money that are doled out that allow good hypothesis-driven, pre-specified, rigorous clinical research.
Indeed,
And I think it's only a matter of time. It was very easy for people to poo-poo this and to say, oh, it couldn't be done or it shouldn't be done or it could make people sick. But it's very hard to ignore a population of people who have type 1 diabetes, who have hemoglobin A1Cs that are on average 5.67% with a standard deviation of 0.6. And that's what what Dr. Ludwig's paper shows. And if you're thinking at all about type 1 diabetes, you should be asking yourself, how did they do that? And so if you're a cynic, you might say, oh, well, they did it because they're special and they were highly motivated and low carb itself doesn't confer any advantage for type 1. But if you were an optimist, I think you would look at this, you say, maybe they figured something out.
One of your calls during your presentation was to adults with type 1 diabetes who've managed to successfully do this, to engage with clinics.
Yes.
Is that part of the conversation you're hoping to drive?
Yeah, so we had volunteers at the in the hospital when I served as the chief of the diabetes clinic, and I think it's a really powerful influence because the more people who live with the condition, who are thinking about the condition, are around the healthcare providers, the more opportunity is to ensure that the care is faithful to their needs.
Right.
And we started off with a dear friend of mine, David Boyles, who is close to 70, who's had type 1 diabetes for many, many, many years. And he, on his own, spontaneously decided he wanted to volunteer in a diabetes clinic.
Wow.
And he's a guy who wears cowboy boots, and he's a hunter. He's hunted on multiple continents.
Excellent. Yep.
And he is he's an awesome, amazing, larger-than-life character. And he would volunteer in our clinic and walk in and meet families. And people would, mothers would see his pump on his belt, and they would just break down crying.
Yeah.
And because they had essentially thought that their children would never live long enough to be as old as this dude.
And this guy's a robust
human
being on top of everything, and they were worried their children would be brittle diabetics all their lives.
At the time I met him, he was riding these unusual motorcycles that can go on and off-road, and and he would go on these extended touring trips, and he had ridden all around the world. And so he's a very thoughtful guy. We spent a lot of time talking. He became a close friend. When he comes to Houston, sometimes he even stays with me. And I feel like I've learned an immense amount from him and from other people who live with type 1. And so his presence really changed the clinical service that I oversaw. And what I observed was that people were less likely to blame those who live with diabetes for their struggles.
Right.
And more insightful and more open and more empathetic. And I think it's also possible that the people who were providing diabetes care but were a little bit resentful about it just decided to get away from it. And the people who were really excited began to learn what he was saying.
It's a natural filter.
Yeah. And so I sort of think of him as a real cultural pioneer for pediatric diabetes, and I would love to have many other volunteers. My friend Jamie Goldman was volunteering in our clinic as well. We never really got the volunteer program as busy and as robust as I would have liked. But I would encourage any listener who has diabetes who would like to share with others to march down to their local diabetes clinic or hospital and suggest that they'd like to volunteer.
Yeah.
And I
not
suppose
that they have an agenda, not to say I'm a low carb.
Exactly.
I'm just a diabetic who managed to.
Right. And just offering cultural support, especially for newly diagnosed families, can be immensely helpful. You have to be a little bit careful, of course, because the experience of somebody who has lived with type 1 diabetes is immense, and those who are newly diagnosed, they're just on their journey.
Yeah.
But as long as you approach the experience with kid gloves and you're sort of thinking about ways to be open and authentic and respectful, what happens in the clinical encounter is you realize that you have a lot to offer. Again, I cannot tell you the number of times when we were able to make some real breakthroughs with families where they started thinking much more holistically about their children's diabetes after having conversations with adults who had diabetes.
Yeah, I have a barrier myself to talking to type 1 diabetics because as a type 2 diabetic, I feel I'm not qualified to talk about the challenges that they're going to face because for me, they're all theoretical.
Yeah, I don't know about that because I would argue that in a fair and just world, someone in your town would think, oh, there's that Richard Morris guy. He's a pretty smart dude, and he could teach me, how to eat food that wouldn't drive my blood sugars up.
Right.
And there is a lot of cross-pollination between the type 2 and the type 1 world around low carb. And frankly, I would not be here at Low Carb Gold Coast if it weren't for the obesity and crisis in type 2 diabetes. There is much more attention, and we're learning much more in the type 2 world than we are in the type 1 world right now. It's moving much faster.
Yeah.
But I still believe that you have a lot to offer. I send people who have type 1 resources that are primarily directed towards the low carb or obesity or type 2 community. Because I know that they're going to be generally applicable. There are some unique things around type 1, like, how much insulin do you take for protein? Where somebody who has type 1 probably can confer some unique advantage, but there's a lot of generalizable solutions.
I might do that actually. So I want to close out this interview with an anecdote that David Lim told me last night, and he was he's one of the low carb doctors here. He's got a practice in Sydney, and he was at a restaurant across the road the other day for lunch, and he noticed a young family. Or a family with a young child and they were injecting the child with insulin. And so he introduced himself and he said, I don't know if, I don't want to intrude, but, I'm a physician and I treat, I see you're injecting insulin. Do you know who's across the road? He said. And he went on to talk about this conference that we were having and, said, this is a great opportunity. Professor Kushner is here and he's talking about type 1 diabetics. And so, he invited them to the conference, and Rod Taylor was more than happy to let them sit in, and you went and had a chat to them for almost an hour. Is that? Do I have that story right?
Yeah, that's right. And amazingly, the week prior, the family had contacted their local caring physician about the possibility of exploring low carb.
Really? Wow.
And had been rebuffed.
Oh, no.
And so they had been thinking about low carb, and their rationale went as follows. We struggle with our child's weight, who's had some unfortunate weight gain. We'd really like to find a way to reduce the glucose swings in between very high and very low blood sugars. We know that there's a lot of interest in this whole low carb thing, and we'd like to know, could this apply to our child?
Those are the right questions to ask.
And the answer was no.
No, that's the wrong answer to give.
And the answer was absolutely not. It's all rubbish. It could put you in harm's way. It's an interesting story. So I sat down with them and we talked, and I tried to offer advice. Of course, they're going to need a local physician who is caring and thoughtful.
So they needed a sympathetic physician.
Yeah, they needed a sympathetic physician, and it's clear that they weren't going to get it locally. And I suggested that they might enjoy meeting Dr. Troy Stapleton.
Right.
And he's a person who lives with type 1 diabetes. He's a radiologist.
Yeah.
A really dynamic person.
He's been on our show.
Yeah. So I actually dragged them over to meet him. Yeah. And they were thrilled. And the question they were asking was, where can we go for healthcare? And he had a few names, actually. Right. And it's not easy to find a GP or an endocrinologist who will support low carb, but they were able to do that. And hopefully that journey will continue. I also gave them a big, long list of resources. And I do have a list of resources I'm happy to share with your listeners.
Can we put that in the show notes?
Yes, certainly. Right. But, one interesting challenge is just finding healthcare in your local community that can truly be supportive. And I think that there's lots of reasons why people with diabetes or people who are interested in low carb can do things on their own and should be able to do things on their own independent of their healthcare team. But we depend upon healthcare for some unique things, and we should demand that they support us. And we need to find people who are open to low carb, and then we need to encourage them.
Nourish them,
exactly. Yeah. And then ultimately send people to those practices. And my hope would be over the coming decade that this this network of low carb friendly or open physicians would grow and grow and grow, and that it represented a unique growth opportunity in local communities so that people would be free to make their own choices.
Well, that's wonderful, Professor Kushner. It's been a wonderful chat, and thank you very much for schlepping all the way out here to Australia to speak to us yokels. Much appreciated.
Australia's an amazing place, and Low Carb Down Under, let me just say, is an incredible conference, and the people who are running it, Rod Taylor and others, are doing a spectacular job, and it's an incredible gift to the world, frankly.
Yeah. What Rod and Jamie and also Jeff Gerber in America do, these guys really basically they fund the thing themselves, and they are the reason that the low carb community is different this time round than it was in 2004 or that it was in the 80s. And so, they make a massive difference. But you shouldn't tell people how wonderful Australia is, because what you have to do is you have to tell people about all of the poisonous animals that you saw and the drop bears, because otherwise there'll be an influx of people. So you have to make sure to get the story straight.
Yeah, that's right. It's smog and it's hot.
Exactly.
And, don't come here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Heard you say you're due for a little.
Great interview, Richard.
Okay, so as I say, that was a wide-ranging conversation. He's a wonderful man, and he cares a lot about type 1 diabetics. He spent almost an hour of his own time. Somebody was at a cafe and saw a family who were injecting their daughter with insulin, and introduced them to Jake Kushner. And this was people just in a cafe across the road from where this event was happening. And Jake came out of the conference and spent an hour with these people, just talking to them about how to deal with type 1 diabetes. And, he's a world expert on the subject. So, lovely guy.
Yeah, excellent. And I saw him at Low Carb Houston.
That was like the next week or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It was just the next week, and I really enjoyed his talk, and his message is so good. And he sort of reminded me of that show that we did with Ian Kelly, type 1 diabetic friend of mine. I think it was show 59.
Mm-hmm.
And Ian was a type 1 diabetic who was used to injecting lots of insulin and covering his food. And although it's totally different from type 2 diabetes, it's almost exactly the opposite in terms of your pancreas.
Yeah.
It's not an overproduction of insulin, but it's no production of insulin.
Yeah.
So you do have to have a constant amount of insulin in your blood. But he noticed that by cutting out carbohydrates, his blood glucose went from swinging wildly in either direction to just smooth and steady.
Right.
And that's exactly what we want for everybody, not just type 1 or type 2 diabetics. Yeah, good stuff.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm starting to feel a little bit peckish. It's carnivore, so I'm feeling like a bit meat rending.
Well, then, let's get right on to some recipes.
What you got, Carl? Hey, you got nothing.
I got nothing. And honestly, something came up. This trip came up. I didn't have time to prepare anything. My Carnovember has been very simple. I'm a simple person. Steak, burgers, pork, bacon, chicken. I haven't been too fancy in the kitchen this week, so I'm going to punt and let you take over. And if I get a recipe together before the show comes out, I'll upload it and
outstanding.
I'll put it on the show in the show notes.
No worries. Well, my Carnovember has not been too dissimilar.
So what do you got?
Well, my Carnovember has not been very different. It's been fairly simple. It's just been meat. And, but one thing I've found is that when I cook meat in a pan, I end up with a lot of fat left over in the pan. And, I don't want to waste that. I don't want to eat lean meat. I don't want to go to all the effort of buying, lovely marbled meat just to eat lean meat, just to eat the meat after the fat is rendered out. I want to take advantage of that.
Right.
So I found a technique that, I don't know if I've invented it, but I've certainly came up with it on myself. I don't know if anybody else uses this technique. See if this works for you. Let's say you've got a pan and you've just pulled the meat out and you've got all of the rendered fat in that pan.
Okay.
The pan's just been on. So you just turn the pan off.
Yeah.
It's still blipping away. The fat is still boiling. Now, what I want you to do is I want to add into that pan. So you have the oil rendered out, but you also have on the bottom of the pan, you have the fond. And that's the sticky bits on the bottom of the pan that has all of the flavor.
Yeah.
So you want to grab both the fond and the oil and you want to turn it into a sauce. So here's the trick. Add some water or some stock. You want to add a liquid that is going to quickly drop the temperature of the oil down from boiling until just warm. warm enough to be able to, warm enough to serve. And so you're going to add some stock. I sometimes use stock ice cubes. When I make a stock, I put it in ice cubes into the fridge.
Yeah. So
I'll drop a couple of ice cubes in there and they'll blip away. They'll make a really loud complaining noise. You want to put the extraction fan on, otherwise your smoke alarm will have a chat to you. But so
right.
Anyway, what you want to do is you want to use that water to pull the fond off the bottom of the pan. Now, normally you just pour out the oil before you put the water in, before you're trying to deglaze the pan, is the technical term.
Right.
I'm leaving the oil in. Now, here's the problem. You've lowered the temperature. You now have water and you have oil, and they're not going to mix, right? Right. Well, I have a technique. So I add a little bit of... So you could add an emulsificant like lecithin,
right,
or sodium tricitrate. This we use that a lot for cheeses, for example. And what that does is that it allows oils and water to become such fine droplets that they will sit in an emulsion.
Right.
And I have a trick. So I use Philly cheese. Now, Philly cheese actually contains sodium tricitrate. You could use Velveeta as well.
Really?
Yeah. You could use like cheese slices.
I didn't know that.
They all used sodium tricitrate. It was invented specifically for emulsifying cheeses. But I use Philly cheese because it turns into liquid really quickly, and and then you just get a whisk in there and you whisk it around, and the Philly cheese, you don't need a lot, like a half a teaspoon or a teaspoon in a large pan. And what it does, it turns that water, that nasty water and oil mix, into almost like a meat mayonnaise. It's delicious. You pour that over your meal. That's what I call a special sauce.
Yeah.
So that's my recipe.
Oh, yeah. That's awesome. What a great show. Thanks for getting these interviews.
You're welcome.
Yeah, these are very, very welcome. Finney was off the charts, and Jake Kushner what a great message and a great guy.
Yeah. I got a couple more from the Gold Coast, and then I think I've got a couple more coming from Low Carb Sydney. So there'll be a few more Aussies, I think. And maybe a couple of Kiwis as well.
Fantastic. That's a great show.
Of course, if you have anything you want to tell us, something we said wrong, something that you don't agree with, some more research that you found to support or refute, anything that we've said, send it by email to dudes@2ketodudes.com. or post it on our website.
And you can follow us on Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram at 2KetoDudes. Make sure to use the hashtag 2KetoDudes.
And of course, if you want to join the free ketogenic forum, it's forum.2keto.com, and you can have a look around the ketogenic forum without needing to create an account by starting with success.2keto.com.
And if useless swag is your fancy, like t-shirts, coffee mugs, and all that other junk with witty keto sayings on them, head over to gear.2keto.com.
And if you want a shot at getting some of that swag for free, join the 2Keto Dudes fan club. You'll be eligible to win something in every show. Go to fanclub.2keto.com.
And if you feel like supporting our forums and all the podcasts we produce, and I sincerely hope that you do, think about making a monthly pledge on our Patreon page at patreon.2keto.com.
You can also see all of our podcasts and other videos on YouTube at youtube.2keto.com.
And if you haven't already, go leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That's how new people get to know about what we do. 2 Keto Dudes is brought to you by 2 Keto LLC, who strives to support the low-carb community with podcasts and other publications. My friend, keep calm, keto on, and fast when you can.
Yeah, keep calm, keto on, Carl, and Keto Fest at least once a year.
Yeah, absolutely. KetoFest.com. Go sign up. And we'll see you next time on 2 Keto Dudes.